you know that your knees could go past 90 degrees before you heard Joel Seedman talk on the contrary?
I kind of like Joel Seedman more and more.
He sticks to his guns and he owns it. I think there's some integrity there for sure.
He's a strong dude. I mean, he lives it. Yeah, his narratives, I don't even know if he believes them. I think it's just a selling tool. But I just wonder if you put someone doing like the knees over toes, like end range limit, and then you had someone doing 90 degrees, I think the 90-degree guy might beat out the other person in an athletic event.
I think so.
I mean,
yeah, no, I think so too. I think there's just more force. There's more like need for stability in the knee.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to squat ass to grass if you're a basketball player, football player.
Yeah, LeBron's a pretty clear indicator of that.
Right.
Yeah. How you been, man?
I've been good. Surviving. I'm alive.
That's good to hear.
2022, we're doing it.
Yeah. It's been a while since we saw each other. When was the last time? When was it that you came to S10? That was like a year and a half ago.
Yeah, a little over a year, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you guys met?
In person, yeah. I had fanboyed him in his DMs a little bit, but in person we met at S10.
Yeah, was that the first time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Seemed like I knew you before that, but yeah. Internet.
Yeah. Convenience of Instagram and all this.
Right.
Were you kind of doing your mewing stuff at that point, Nate? Or were you still kind of like developing it?
I think the first onset of the mewing was that bite band pull up. At the very least, having content out. But no, I had not developed any content until maybe around that point. Yeah.
That's cool. DJ, I wanted to get your take on kind of a topic we were just spitballing off earlier. There's with people with like shoulder issues, neck issues, maybe even like just cranial issues in general. There's one, I guess, approach that people have where it's just try to relax everything. Like I'm going to lay you down on the ground. I'm going to support you as best you can. I'm going to put kind of bubble wrap around you so that you can just like breathe without tensing your neck. And then there's obviously another approach, which I think like Nathan's more into, you're more into, which is let's use these suckers, let's strengthen them. And then hopefully in getting more support, more just structure and function to the area, we actually can achieve some of that relaxation that we're looking for. Are there times where you find yourself like trending more towards like, okay, this person just needs to chill out first before I try to approach any kind of bite training or neck training? Or in general, is the load the thing that kind of allows them to achieve relax?
Yeah, I go towards the adding tension somewhere as opposed to trying to decrease tension as a first step. Because if there's something in a position that we want less of, it usually there's an active oppositional force to control out of it. Like it's all on a spectrum of movement. So I'm thinking just as long as they have control of as many parts, and it's usually adding the voluntary flex of a muscle that they haven't before, which gives them control in and out of position. So yeah, I lean towards that. And, maybe it's not the same for everyone, but case by case, it's always, where's the holes? Let's add the control of tension there. If that makes sense.
I was curious, what is your background, or at the very least, what do you attribute your orientation to knowing how to resist tension? Where did you learn it in the most like simple or basic of forms before you had words for it?
Learning how to resist tension? I'm football. I guess when I was a kid, I was pushing and being pushed upon a lot. Yeah, creating tension, or I guess that sort of strength stuff, like just generating a lot of force, came more natural to me, which is why I'm maybe biased towards it.
Got it. I was kind of leaning toward because I know you do a lot of grappling, and I wondered if you attribute your ability to stay relatively braced on your feet, or like not being taken off your feet, to being that preliminary resistive training.
I don't know. I'm sure my whole entire personal history of relationship with resistance has had a effect. Yeah, I don't know. There's too many variables for me to figure that out.
Yeah, all good, all good. The reason why I ask, it's one thing that I definitely can like image back to knowing why I have strong shoulders, or at least being able to like maintain some stability through my shoulders and relative stability through my elbows and the like, is probably because people would throw me in an arm bar as a kid, and it would take all of my body's ability to focus on this, as opposed to being like you can no longer be here when someone has this and they take your end range and they try to really exceed it. And I think that the allowance there was not a stretch as much as it was like an active tensioning effort at first, learning how to, okay, someone just did something a little reckless with me. I have to guard, but I have to guard within reason so that I can also like move through a tension that I'm not just stuck in here. That's where I like find my orientation around it.
I think kids do that well. I mean,
Yeah.
kids can just drop, land, maneuver out of things. And yeah, I'm wondering that like kid strength, that ability to just eat shit and get back up unscathed, is something we lose as adults.
Yeah.
And that's got to be something. It's not the actual hardware, right? It's more of something with the nervous system
I agree.
that we lose touch with. And I felt that I'm going back to football. It's just, I never got hurt once from playing, what was it, over a decade. I never got hurt on the field, really, like bumps and bruises, but I got hurt in the weight room a lot more. And I was getting like car accidents, pile ups with people diving on you, awkward positions. Um, yeah, and I know, even though at times I was stronger after, my whatever joint ranges of motion were more resilient, and I could absorb more force in different pieces of my tissues, whatever. But I would get hurt, I feel like, if I went back in, um, to a week of hitting or those situations. I can't absorb force as a unit, as a whole, as much as I could before.
Yeah.
Yeah, that keeps me up some nights thinking about the mechanisms behind that.
Yeah, I wonder. I was gonna say, I wonder. In theory, you could probably gradually expose yourself to it and maybe achieve at least half of that same like resilience or like almost carefree attitude you had as a kid. But it's just something about the aging process, or just like maybe it's the amount that you have to lose at this point, like as a trainer yourself and like needing to sustain yourself, and you have all these physical like hobbies and stuff. If you get like your femur snapped or something, that's maybe in your mind a little bit more significant than if that were to happen as a kid.
Yeah, that's true. I have a theory that I mean, if you look at, I mean, Tom Brady's one of them. I think if he would have stopped and took 15 years off at some point, I don't think he'd be able to go back. I think there's some sort of capacity of like shock absorption on the tissue. Um, and the closest I don't think plyometrics, really, ballistic stuff really recreates it. But I think there's something about like, what's that, like the body tempering tools?
Yeah.
Like putting 100 pounds, 200 pounds of steel on you and rolling around, and being able to like accept that into your tissue and like your pressurized system and everything. Like that's something I feel like that you get in contact sport that you don't really get in regular physical training.
I agree with you. I think that's an externalized effort for output versus comfort. The relative awareness that even if you manage to hit someone well, you can still hurt yourself. And so you have to orient around, I'm not just stopping this person from moving, but I'm also stopping myself in a lot of places from moving. And that's going to hurt really bad if I do it wrong. And the allowance factor is always staying perturbated, I think. So this is something that I was thinking about just yesterday about boxers. And I was talking to someone about his client who I'd been working with a little bit. And their proclivity to go from striking a bunch, like using their like in the cardio of that, to going to running, and just the consistency of needing the like perturbatory feedback of that force going through what is almost a lever, like your fully extended lever, that creates a real large draw of force that squats don't necessarily do. That's why sprinting, for example, is one of the most force inducing things that you can do. But basically just saying that someone like that is essentially depending on the continuous inputs because their body is so damaged that in order for them to be allowant for each thing that they're doing output wise, they need to be able to reorient that stimulus and not be shocked by it. So I think it is a sensory thing that their tissue is used to being bothered and having to reflexively and or coincidentally move with a bracing effort.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, in my head, like when you hold a long stick and you kind of map that stick and that space onto your body now, like it's part of you. There's something in striking and sport where it's the kinetic energy, you're always like sending it in space and receiving in whether it's the ground, a ball, another person. It like gets so wide, like your map of things that you're interacting with. I wonder if like you could measure that in the brain, like how small that grows when you don't have any of that, which is like conventional exercise, right? You're not sending your center of mass and it being manipulated by other objects and other forces in space. So when you're talking about always getting that feedback, I'm always that reminds me of like the sense and control of this kinetic energy, which is always being kind of orchestrated in a huge arena.
Yeah. It feels multifaceted. It feels like the refraction of like light on a crystal where there becomes new perspectives almost as you become like oriented around that sensory aspect. It starts to be like you can perceive where you're at without having to be visually oriented there. And that becomes almost like you're seeing from multi dimensions.
That's a hit of dopamine right there.
Oh yeah.
Like, I think that's why Olympic lifting is so addicting to people, is it's like this distilled essence of taking a mass, moving yourself around it, and then catching it above you. And you get this huge rush, similar to golf, where you're sending a tiny ball across the field where you want it. There's something about projecting, sending, and manipulating things that we're hardwired to do, but yeah, you get a big rush.
Well, even playing basketball, like the feeling, you almost know it's going in most of the time before it actually hits there. You just have a sense based off of your relationship with the rim that obviously needs to be honed in order for you to have that level of sensation. But you ask any like high level shooter, like the minute, almost probably before it even leaves their hand, they already know if that was the right projection or not.
Yeah, the perfect hit. It's like striking, like and you feel, and you're like yes, and then it follows through. I think that's something about, once again, like even like when we were hunters, we had to think of the future and project something into the future in space, and we had to first aim, have a target, and then we're sending, and when it hits, it's like we knew it lined up with our prediction, right? And yeah, that's, I mean, that's where sport, I think sports came out of that. It's like we're just trying to hit targets and hone our prediction and execution and line them up.
Totally. That comes to brings to mind that we're all different, respective of our priority systems, and they're sensory, but they're going to be different sensory systems, whether it be proprioception, or it be visual and vestibular, or it be uh,
Interoception.
yeah, interoception's a rarer one for people. So I don't know if there'd be another that I would classify as like a whatever. Let's keep it as proprioceptive and visual for the time being. Interoceptive is rare. I think respective of the visual people, that comes into playing sports like with a ball. And then when you come into the non-visual or proprioceptive, they don't track necessarily with being able to follow the ball as much as they do the feedback from the ball. So where you said like the punch, even though boxers are very visual targeting, they are staying in that proprioceptive field of knowing how big they are and how much reach they have or how much distance, because their eyes are being knocked around, and the amount of like TBI, excuse me, that most of them walk around with and then perpetuate with like continuous tensions that the amount of like, this is a sidetrack, but the next stuff that I see a lot of boxers do, or like the training that I see a lot of boxers do is uh, further exacerbating traumas. Like it's further perpetuating the tensions that they live with because it justifies them knowing how to propriocept, but it doesn't justify them knowing how to visually adjust, which would require more peripheral allowance or parasympathetics. And that's just not something that fighters really thrive off of, contingent on injuries. And that's just what I've seen, because the most of that majority of them, when I work on them, even if it's something as simple as like one exercise for 12 seconds, and I'm not even exaggerating, this is something that happened just a few days ago with two of them. They were like yawning up a storm. They're like, they had just gotten in the gym. They haven't started their workout. They're like, I'm ready to go get lunch. I'm hungry. And so their parasympathetics had uptaken enough that they registered that they were really like voraciously hungry or in need of something to turn their nervous state.
Do you feel like fighters and people like that are constantly they're imbalanced in the sympathetic?
Yeah.
And that any parasympathetic upregulation is beneficial?
Yes and no. I think coherence around the parasympathetic upregulation is good because inputs are where they live. But if they can't choreograph the inputs, they're going to recognize the inputs as threat or invasive because it's not something that coincides with them creating action. So the thing that I've seen with athletes in particular, because most of them are sympathetic, with the exception of baseball players, I see that they're they're the most visually acute athletes on earth. They have like the vision of a hawk or something, like some comparative to like some unbelievable bird visual. And that's like their tracking behavior for like the speed with which they can track objects. But everyone else I've worked with measures themselves off a proprioceptive basis, and it usually comes to terms with like, if anything makes them feel like they lose the tension with which they can be actionable in the immediacy, they're going to feel like that is a non-welcome or uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's kind of interesting to think about how you're balancing that in like a feat of strength, which obviously DJ you're well known for. Do you find that you have certain ways of keeping yourself relatively parasympathetic, like preventing yourself from going like full mouth breathing or like panicking under the stone that could potentially fall on your head at any point? Like I imagine some of the jaw kind of bite stuff actually probably helps you maintain that sense of control without, again, like gritting your teeth to the point of like self-damage. Are there other things that you notice that kind of keeps you like focused enough while the weight and the task itself obviously demands a certain level of sympathetic activity?
Maybe, yeah, just the fact that you have less of an option not to be in the moment when, especially putting something over your head can kill you. I think that that's just you have no option but to be in the moment and not think about other things. So, yeah, I don't have any ritual routine, but I know that when I'm putting it up, nothing else is in my head. It's actually a very good feeling for me. I enjoy.
Do you find that in that sensation or in that experience, you embody yourself more than you experience yourself behind your eyes?
Yes, I would say so.
Do you feel like you have better access to memories and you live in a state of limbic fluidity like that?
I don't think so.
No.
No,
Okay.
there's not much going on up there, which is kind of the thing I enjoy.
Yeah.
Not much going on cognitively thinking. It's really a felt sensation thing, like uh, balance on my feet. How rooted am I? And I have to leverage this thing. Just very like felt.
Yeah.
Um, Sort of like, jujitsu is one of those things when you're talking about visual versus felt. Like a lot of people close their eyes during that because they can just focus more on the feeling and leverages. So it feels like more on that side of the spectrum for me.
Okay. So it sounds, in just that saying, it sounds it's just more proprioceptive and you have enough of your body built out that you have a place to go when you become proprioceptive, that there's not like loose wires, so to speak, that things are plugged in and you have the mass to coordinate your actual skeleton.
Sure, yeah, very like trunk midline proprioception,
Yeah.
uh, dealing with those things.
Got it. So that's the ideal of, like, when I say on the far end of parasympathetic performance, you're not becoming so parasympathetic that you become this like alpha male in silence, or like this like smooth flow state like warrior. It's not like there's the opposite side of like an esoteric version of performance. It's that your body is so tolerant to force that it doesn't start to perpetuate action or tension that would be like, I'm unfamiliar here, or I need to tension because this is not safe. It's allowant and also confident in the ability to adjust while under load. And that only happens when you have one, muscle mass, two, coherent connection between the nerves and that and your brain, and then the relationship between that behavior and whatever your memories. So it like has to be that it's not just isometric function, that you don't just have a core, you have something that feels like it can manage the uptake and inputs everywhere else without losing the focus of inputs.
How would you define or explain coherency,
Between what?
like in the context of how you're using like coherent?
Having coincidental functioning, that you're not trying to tell it to do something because it already knows what you want for it to do. So there's not an impasse in the muscle, or there's not an impasse in the train down to wherever you're talking to that feels like, no, I want to do this, or I'm ready to do this. You have tissue that's strong enough to take form under your will, not fixed to a strength that you feel like you have to work around.
Mm, okay, so more like um, ingrained, automatic,
Yeah.
Really just trust.
coordinated.
I guess you could just say trust, right?
Yeah, but it's the torque. I mean, you have you have a wherewithal that you bring your force inward, that it comes to a point that it strains your visceral body. So even when you're doing something that you might be predisposed to use your hands heavily, you're focusing on how you can ballast preemptively or brace preemptively. And so you're working around your viscera even without knowing it, because you know that's going to optimize at the point of full fulcrum, or like the heaviest load on the lever. You need more output here to have make, so you already optimize your viscera. And that's really, if any sport that's rotational and any sport that's going to have you be perturbated or taken off your normal, you need to know how to collect your center, because your center is where you orient around. It's, I mean, not just your spine, but all of your organs, that if there's at any point a threat to them, your body is going to protectively try to whatever. Like, think kidney shot in boxing. Is there, if there's anything that folds someone surprisingly, like 4 seconds after the fact, it's a kidney shot. So
DJ, would you say that kind of what he's describing of bringing force inward is generally how you feel and would define internal torque, with kind of the way that you've felt it out? I know, like, you can think about that in terms of like the limbs and squeezing in as opposed to spreading out, but in terms of like closer to the midline, is it kind of feel like internal torque kind of builds like a central, like almost ball of energy, versus external is more so the exporting of that energy?
Exactly, yeah. I think internal and external torque are both from the I mean, I visualize it like an inch below the belly button in like the Dantian region. Like, something about that center connects. I think that's the like Julien Pinal calls it the first arch of the foundation, and then there's, you know, the oblique system there, TVA, pelvic floor, like there's that region. Spreading out is like lats, pecs, biceps. You get more distal, and the more distal things are just, I think, kind of an expression of something you're sending from that center region. At least that's the felt experience, and that's how I cue people. I'm always cueing there. I rarely cue, and you know, unless I'm giving them an implement to use the expression orient towards, it's still that that gut region I'm poking around on.
I've had a scar around that area for 16 years or so, and I've noticed that the more that I've worked on it, the more that that's come back. And I hadn't known that there was a discord there, but I realized that I was becoming progressively less rotationally tolerant, and I was also becoming progressively less like stimulus tolerant, like as a byproduct of having less force tolerance there, and it was becoming stiffer. I was just becoming more intolerant.
Do you see? Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, that's the one thing everyone I've assessed. There's, so if we have that region below the belly button and we go, you know, that like V line, so let's say external obliques right there. There's always one side where I poke and people have a hard time contracting it, or it goes off during a squat or range of motion. And then after that, you know, we'll see some sort of rotation, some sort of compensation, whatever. Almost everyone has that on one side. And it, you know, reminds me of all these systems that kind of bring up similar things like PRI. They're like, we have this asymmetry that we've learned to compensate into. And yeah, I don't know the mechanism. I don't know the language, but there's something there. And I think so many people I see are just within their own model of thinking, are trying to affect and work with whatever that structure is to balance it out.
So I have a theory around that one. I don't think it's so much what the structure is, but I think about how much the structure you can perceive. And I think that in your relationship with it, you can perceive a lot of the echolocative quality of your pelvis, that it's three-dimensional respective your torso and trunk, that there's not a segue or like an impasse. And with mine, I know that there is an impasse. I actually have a couple that I found, like bends in my spine that have impacted a lack of synergistic, like you think energy flow or whatever, blood flow, or just having less focus on the area because it feels like it's doing its own thing and I don't have to hold it together. I think the thing that we are not aware of is there's a lot of negative space inside of us. And because we become so extrinsic, we have capacitated an awareness for, oh, maybe I move around a place in my body that may be a little more adipose or a little more inflamed or a little bit more uh, uh, stale, from like in your intestines in particular, which would be most localized there. And that would be the pouch. I think most people create a pouch or a paunch on the front of their pelvis that is reflective of um, excuse me, gas buildup as well as waste buildup and a lack of supportive blood flow through the intestines that would make it feel like there was some buoyancy. So they have to redirect it to the most massively supportive tissue. And for most people, that's the front of the groin, that they have the most development on the front end, like they can rest it in their thighs or whatever, or it's like they move around and mechanize around that way because it's something that's not them, but it's something they can't change because it's not them. They're not passing it. They're moving around it. And so until such time as like in Stop Chasing Pain, he talks a lot about like the moving of lymph. And I noticed that a lot of the lymph areas, if they're not moving well, they're not sensitive. And if they're not sensitive, then the sensation that they're perceiving is probably baroreception and or force moving through that makes it in some way seem like they can perceive the anterior or interior. Um, so yeah, people are propriocepting really heavily around things as opposed to interocepting is all. They don't actually feel their inside, where you feel your inside because you're in a good body.
So maybe would you say breathing is one of the tools to increase that?
Yes and no. So the breathing I've seen is either contractile around the intestines or it reduces visceral blood flow. That's why I emphatically I'm like, why do you have to get bigger for this stuff? Because you're not necessarily getting bigger in your superficial tissue, but your visceral organs do need to saturate. And then once they are starting to supply you a concurrent, not just like, oh, I can see where they are, ping, all right, what are you guys up to? Ping, but they should concurrently tell you how they are so that you have a body intelligence. And that in like, there's a number of Eastern practices. I'm not sure exactly which one references it, but I think that they abide it over a scope or that is the body has an intelligence that we're trying to improve on. And the more that we can improve upon that intelligence, the less we have to rely on the one that's more conscious. And as the body intelligence grows, our energy grows or whatever, our perceptions grow. And so that is the accountability for energy and all the variability in energetics and more, less science born practices.
So body intelligence would mean like specifically the gut, viscera, and then maybe the heart.
Yeah, I
Is that
think
included in it? I mean, they
more-
both have neural like tissue
definitely.
that sends a lot of information upward, right? I mean, this is kind of just to manage all that.
Right, exactly right. I would say this is the bureaucratic end of the thing, the business that goes on. And if you think about the live business that goes on, or at least the pace of business going on, you look at your lungs and you look at your heart and you look at your brain, because there's going to be an order of operations relative your state. If you're a visually dominant person, you're likely very thoughtful. Same with being proprioceptive, depending on the quality of your tissue. So if you're more sympathetic and you don't have that built out capacity for paying attention to your organs at the same time as paying attention to your superficial body, then you're probably going to be stuck in fight or flight more often than you would be allowed that parasympathetic turnover. I think for most people getting into things, the reason why I emphasize not so much breath work, but I emphasize visceral sensation is because if we don't realize where we hold superficial tension, then we don't realize where we manage our muscle and our tensions relative our intrinsic body. So our organs have muscles, but because we've superficiated the tension, it stayed in our abs, it stayed in our bicep, it stayed in our shoulders for too long. We don't know how our lungs are being pushed into our ribs or how our ribs are moving around our organs. We know how our skin suit is moving around our ribs. And in that, we're trying to create an extrinsic to intrinsic tension just because maybe it's because we can see it, maybe it's because it's being perturbated by wind, but not deep enough that we can feel it on the deeper muscle. Like people feel their skin more often than they feel anything else. So they get localized to, oh, I'm going to tension around the skin. I'm not going to tension around my liver because what does that even mean? Or I'm not going to tension around my kidneys because I can't see that. Or my heart. Putting tension around your heart is probably a scary concept for most people.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. The mediastinum is literally, I think, the thing we move from a large part of the time because of how much input our heart and lungs have. If when you see someone doing a lift for their first time, I imagine, and this is what I see, they inhale on their first efforts, or they inhale or breathe inward when they're trying to conceptualize of a thing. And so they're doing the thing that interbulates them because it helps them perceive their inner body. And oxygen is literally just a nervous irritant. When you breathe it in, it sets fire to the things that are inflamed, or it lets you breathe or circulate through the things that are tissue supported. And more often than not, we're inflamed, so it's going to be like lighting up the muscles that have issue. And with that said, I see most people when they're doing breath work, they'll pay attention on the inhale and then they'll rush the exhale because they can't pay attention, and that's panicky for them. And so there's no anaerobic tolerance to inputs. That is because they don't feel like they're creating a pressure, or they have like a control of the pressure unless they're inhaling. They don't have an ability to resist the ingression or the feeling of CO2 buildup or waste buildup or whatever it may be that they have while they're not breathing.
So you think that that's less mechanical, like that's not the eccentric control of the diaphragm that they're lacking. It's more of a chemical, like CO2 receptors making them want to panic.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the ways you learn to brace first, because that was the way I learned to brace first too, some type of contact and learning how to maintain my mass. We learn how to do the Valsalva maneuver. So like learning how to breathe on the intake or the loading phase of a squat, for example, or the loading phase of, actually, no, that's how we do it. Yeah, the loading phase of a squat, for example, like people will breathe inward when they're on their down so as to create a buoyancy of their lungs to manage the pressure downward, because this is the thing with which we change our pressure. If you think about a syringe, this is the syringe top. It's not the thing feeding in the pressure, our belly is. The lungs are the thing that are feeding in the negative pressure so that we can manage the blood pressure downward, or like the visceral loading, the baroreception downward. And it's like, I like to think about this as being the aerobic side, the stuff above our sternum or diaphragm, and then the anaerobic side being beneath it. And our ability to press through the anaerobic side is our tolerance for CO2, or at least allowing the tissue to saturate instead of our midline to feel like it's being moved around by air. And when we let our tissue saturate, it's going to be a couple of seconds of maybe a slower breath or maybe not inhaling. Then we're dealing with all of the inputs or the increasing tensile load, which is going to be like saying this nerve talks to this nerve, talks to all these nerves, which is going to be like messages, 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 which is at the point where we're going to feel like this is happening to us. And usually that's like being underwater. We want to take a breath. And if we can tolerate our panic, which is literally all it is, we can tolerate the increase of inputs without reacting emotionally to them.
Yeah, awareness of viscera, I've never thought about that as a trainable skill, but it makes me think of like the samurai, like the harakiri, where
Yeah.
they would stab themselves there to kill themselves in the gut, because that's where they believe their center was. Like that's where they identified the I
Yeah.
was there. So it's very interesting, even just culturally, if you live not thinking you're up here, but like connecting to this center as your state of being, how different your relationship with emotions and energy would be.
Totally.
That's interesting.
Yeah. The one thing I've noticed in our conversation with this, it being so like readily available, our understanding of language, when people talk about sensation or creating a visceral awareness or whatever, it's usually they perpetuate this visualization effort. And we have these nerves in our body to act like eyes, or at the very least to act like this lighting up effect that our brain can receive and perceive. And it's not about us telling our brain what we see as much as it is about our brain being able to see it. And at that point, we have a bigger allowance for inputs, but we also have to maintain that we are managing our inputs. So there's like oh, if I'm tired or fatigued and I'm getting stressed out, am I getting stressed out because I'm tired and fatigued, or because I'm getting, or well, I guess that's the same thing. Because I'm hungry, because I'm haven't slept, or like the specifics of it more better, because you have a clear perception. More better.
Mo better. Mo better.
All right, dude. Caffeine is not a food.
I kind of was thinking about this idea of really connecting to your center, connecting to the kind of visceral pump, or just like the global pump, and how systems that maybe prioritize the fascial line, so say the front line, the back line, the spiral line, they might be missing out on kind of everything that those lines house. And there's a potential, I guess, really with any practice in like overemphasizing a particular like muscle group or muscle chain, in just like almost like I want to say like over developing the awareness of it and kind of inhibiting actually the stuff that again is more so what you are and where the power is coming from. I don't know if that's something in you working with like X movement culture guys, you find that you're like almost training them a little bit out of this like anatomical visual perception of themselves and more into like the entirety of their center.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I see with most skill junkies who can do amazing feats, middle splits, back levers, like all these like straddles gymnastic things. They get almost more and more separated from the center and kind of lost. And I can make these shapes with my joints, but they have really no force transmission or center to rely on for stability. And that, to me, I just look at that, it goes back to just strength, simple strength, and not going outside the edges and trying to reach these extremes, which, it's a trade-off, it's a sacrifice. But yeah, well, how do you guys, so if you're trying to connect someone to this space, this pump within them, to viscera, what's the modality? Is it through movement? Is it through external pressure that they're having to organize around? What are some of the tools you guys like to use?
I made an effort to go around places that I think are deficient in tissue or don't represent where you want to rotate or where you can't. So if we're talking about the nervous system's perception of relax, it's the ability to manage the periphery and be able to be visually acute without having to be overly focal. So you can see everything without having to manage exactly what muscles are fixing it, because that means that your skeleton is going to start to be like that. You're going to start to create tensions coincidental with how your eyes motion. And that starts to play into the neck. And I've noticed most people rotate from their extremity. They don't rotate from their intrinsic body. And there's a number of things that just in feeling it, it upregulates your intrinsic reflexes. And if you have an upregulation of intrinsic reflex, you don't have a question for how relaxed you are. Your brain just did the thing that it was. The yawn is one such thing. A swallow is another such thing. The yawn is, I think, and this is my perspective, I think someone who's over oxidized or under CO2 tolerant. And it is an effort to intrinsically perceive the body without the the lungs forcing the effort. So it's an anaerobic swallow. Like, it's like if you were to say, how would you eat something without chewing on it? You'd open your throat really big, and that's what the yawn does. And as that happens, you're saturating the neck intrinsically with air, or rather circulation, and that's giving you a vagal output, not just an input, but the allowance for more blood flow from where your vagus nerve starts to where it enters into your body. So like your heart, your lungs are going to start to be perceived more directly. So I think that there are certain reflexes that if you can concurrently have active, like right now, saliva building in my mouth, that's something we should all have, but we should also have the concurrent ability to swallow it down. So we shouldn't have dry mouth that prevents us from being able to articulate or move our mouth well or our throat well. We should have the ability to create lubrication and actively, that's what this mewing effort is. Like, it's a regulation of fluids in the mouth to allow for breath. So more space in the neck, to answer your question, is where I start, because that was a randomly wild off track. I'm doing
Can I say something about the yawning? Yeah, that's another thing. We don't know why exactly we yawn, but the theory I had in my head, it's just like, just talking shit at this point. But so many people, when they're offloading CO2 or just exhaling, it's like through the lips, through the mouth. And when you yawn, you're actually having to, you can't use that like filter of the mouth. You have to use this stuff. Like, it's a lot of the down below to do the action instead of up here. Like, you're almost forced to. And I see it as almost like a pandiculation. Like when people like stretch in the morning, it's like that for the gut stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's super interesting.
I think it's built in interoception. So like, if you're super stress state, you're going to have a lot of oxidation to your tissue. You're not going to be parasympathetic in your body. And so you're not going to be embodying that vasovagal response, having that awareness through your vagus nerves and your awareness through your intrinsic belly that gives you that gut brain. So if you're not living in that state, then you're guarding that area because you're not paying attention to it. It's like, it's almost becomes an afterthought that when you're done with the stress, you'll start paying attention to it. And so the more time you live without that area, you're going to start to depreciate its size, its coordination, its muscle, you lose it, you use it, you don't use it, you lose it, whatever the expression is. It's what's happening. Yeah, we do so little with maintaining this that the first thing that people like talk about the benefit in GOTA is that it's intrinsic baby motions. The first intrinsic baby motion is learning how to suction their head upright. That's like what a baby learns to do when they're and when they can suction it past the point of their chest, they're not moving in their aerobic body anymore. They pulled it past their diaphragm. Their esophagus runs through their diaphragm, and that's that transition from aerobic to anaerobic body. And you'll notice that the one place that people are most contracted or small in their body is their thoracic spine, specifically running through their diaphragm area. It's almost like they've congested their entire rib cage to manage how their esophagus can pump food and or air into their belly.
This episode of Monkey Bars is sponsored by the online course Mewing with MovMed. The connections between our neck, jaw, face, throat, and tongue really set the stage for a healthy, well-functioning airway, nervous system, and body. This comprehensive course includes many powerful exercise tutorials, an in-depth webinar, and bonus videos that further demonstrate how these concepts can be applied to yourself or your clients. If you've dealt with headaches, neck or jaw pain, breathing or digestive issues, or feel like you struggle to relax and connect with your internal body, this course can unlock better rest and better performance. Head to MovMed.net to get access to Mewing with MovMed today.
That's interesting. That you said it's the baby controlling the head mass is first a sucking. That's very interesting. I haven't thought about it like that.
Yeah, you get them to cry first so that they can get the water or the fluid out of the area. So there's going to be and that's literally like you ever filled a I don't know if I suppose it's like filling a bag, filling a balloon of air underwater. So you like have your mouth above the level and you're fighting against all that intrinsic pressure. And as soon as you can create that intrinsic pressure, you become buoyant. So it's taking someone that's lived in fluid and they're buoyant in fluid to becoming buoyant out of fluid. And so there's the need for respiration and the capacity to navigate that like bellows effect, almost like you're, and then you can be upright. And the heavier we get, the more we need to, quote unquote, suspend ourselves with that, which is muscle mass, or it's our heart's ability to pump through the body and regulate blood flow.
Well, thank God I was breastfed until the age of 4.
Okay.
Nathan.
That explains a lot.
Jealous. Damn, that's impressive.
Man, that's some crazy shit. Talking about kind of a similar mechanism, the abdominal vacuum. I know, DJ, it's something you've messed around with. Nate, I have a bit as well. Do you guys feel like there's kind of one central intention that kind of drives all of the muscular response with that? Or is it more of like this kind of like conscious flexing around like the midsection that creates that like suction look? I would imagine that the same swallowing mechanism we're talking about kind of is the thing that should in theory drive everything, but I could kind of like, if I just disengage my rectus and like pull in my TVA the right kind of way, I can almost create the look, but I might not have any like engagement through here, right? In your experience, is that just one kind of mechanism?
Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts, but it does seem like an expression of that. The same vacuum, the same sucking. It's like very like this internal, I feel it like in the hips, and I mean that whole chain is related to like the end, maybe it's an end range of that suckle, from below.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
You probably feel your throat pull upward and your butt pucker when you do it. It's a midline stimulative effort. And the more you can do it, the less over-oxidated you are in your body, I would think. And some people do it in a way where they just try to get the front side value, so like the aesthetic of it. But the more you can bring, you're like tube of toothpasting yourself. You're literally taking the air out of yourself, and you have to kind of learn how to maintain that without breath for a little bit until you can manage how much pressure your throat can maintain there. And then it's an abdominal challenge to manage keeping your diaphragm up or elongated so that you can manage your full scope of extension. Once your rib cage deloads, you're essentially learning how to build muscles from that framework. So if you can use that well, you can build muscle or build your height a little bit relative to your frame if you've stayed compressed your whole life. I think that's really what we work around. So the suction here is where I start. and I give cues around being able to manage bringing up their visceral throat so that it fills up into the back of their skull better. So it's not like they're pitching around where their throat ends or where they swallow to, but now they start to perceive where their subocciput starts to be supported. And then you start to become aware that you're like most people's ears, the depth between ears to the back of their head is depreciated because of how much the subocciput is tucking. And that would be like the first posterior tuck. And then you'd start to find that you have similar coincidental tucks happening maybe in your lumbar, maybe in your pelvis. Your jaw is going to support that tuck because you have depth being removed behind your ear. Your jaw is going to retract enough that you feel your throat can be supported forward instead of backward. And so then there becomes this mismatching of how you support yourself, supporting yourself off your tongue instead of your airway. You know, Blue Steel, like Ben Stiller's. So he makes the pucker face, and he's essentially just suckling, and that's the uglier
It's
version.
a duck face.
Yeah, it's the uglier version of the thing, because I assume someone who knew how to do the suction showed someone, and that's what suction looks like from the outside. And so there's like an aspect of literally breastfeeding. That's really what it is, creating a focus here and then creating an ability to pull the pressure when you don't have enough tongue or mouth strength to draw the substance through your gullet, which is not capable of like pushing stuff down yet. So the only thing that happens is it has to move with the pressure flow. And so it's like you're encouraging maybe a little bit of breath at the same time, or they hold their breath and they manage over that breath hold, and that's why they throw up, because they're like going a long period of time of not managing it or it getting stuck or whatever it may be. And that's literally them learning how to breathe and eat, or breathe and whatever, breathe and produce.
Yeah, throwing up is interesting. There's a lot of cultures who like the purge is kind of a point of things, and they see it as like energetically discharging built up stagnant things. And yeah, I felt that. I don't know if it was the drugs during the ritual or process, but I think there's something to like we see it as so like foreign and negative, like such a negative thing. But yeah, that automatic pulsing in that region will make people sore. I mean, you'll be sore from those muscles. Just like if you ever see how much a baby can cry for hours and hours at the top of their lungs, no matter how much an adult cries, they cannot mimic that. They don't have the physical conditioning to even recreate that, like with their like diaphragm contractions. So yeah, I think once again, that region, there's just something about the moving and control and relationship that we're very disconnected to in modern, look of the body.
We know how they're supple. Babies are supple, like their bellies feel like it's like watery. It doesn't feel like it's airy. It doesn't feel like it's pushing against you. You can push into it and it'll sink. So it's saturated. It's like buoyant. There's no negative space, or there's no waste inside that's making it create a stagnant pressure. Like I literally equivocate it to, if you're not able to move your visceral organs, you're going to create a substance or an accommodation for that rotational movement. Or rotational movement is essentially torque to the inner body. So if you don't have the ability to buffer the twisting of your organs, you're going to do something that allows for you to minimize the discomfort. And that's going to be like, people will start to tension or restrict motion in their visceral body and then rotate around it. So they'll move a lot their hips, they'll move a lot at their shoulders. And so you'll see almost like a very stiff thoracic body. And then there's a lot of motion to their neck and their lower back. And it's just because they've avoided where they have their most motile body, because that requires putting force back into the parts of their organs that they maybe it makes them feel like they're going to shit their pants if they put a little bit of force into it. And that's not a feeling they want, because they've had so much time spent not having any force in their belly that instead of them having the, what you say is like the roll in effect, they have the prolapsed effect. And so the prolapsed effect is literally their midline is the thing that's been pushed outward. And so their spine is supporting their midline instead of their midline supporting their spine.
Yeah. Then you're waddling around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's making accommodations or compensations.
DJ, I want to be respectful of your time. Do you need to get out of here at any particular time?
2:30. I'm good. I'm good for time right now.
Okay, cool. I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk about something that I think I saw you post about, which is trying to move and essentially not be scared with how you're using your body in movement, which is something that for a multitude of reasons can occur, whether that's because you don't think you're functional enough yet, so you don't think that you should be accepting load onto your body until you've got the perfect, joint angles or whatever, or potentially you've been injured. So like myself, I ruptured my Achilles like 6 months ago or 7 months ago or so. So there's a level of fear absolutely that comes with, putting new load and having to trust that tissue again. I'm sure it's something that you've worked through with your clients in different regards. Is there any like mindset stuff or just like, graded exposure practices that you found helpful either for yourself or for others?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, of course, number one, always modify the exercise and the environment, the constraints and all that, so that they could be successful and, it's not dangerous. So, but I think the thing on top of that I've seen limit a lot of people is the perception and emotional relationship with movement. There's a story I tell all the time about a lady who she complained about low back pain and said she wasn't able to deadlift. And then we had a drill where it was like ground to overhead with a bag where she would pick it up and press it, pick it up and press it. And when I said, okay, we're just going to deadlift it now, she totally changed how she organized herself. She went to like pick it up halfway and dropped it, even though before she had been picking it up off the ground multiple times just fine. That created pain for her. You could tell she was guarding herself. And attached to that, come to find out is like she related that to injury. She related that to I have to pick it up this way because it's bad if I make this shape with my body. So we're also living in this social, contextual like world of emotions behind exercise, really. And that's one thing that I try to remove people from. So maybe it's changing the implement, changing the equipment, not giving it a name, just setting them up with a task that they could do. So that's something I'm more and more trying to be mindful of when working with people is, okay, we're going to do a squat and not really, I don't know what that means to them and how their body is going to react or perceive that as a threat or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Most people jump into an exercise routine have preconceived notions as to where it goes for them usually. So they want to make sure you're not going to take them there. And so they're like double stepping for you or stepping in front of you to make sure you don't go there too quick.
Yeah, and that's why tactile feedback and like RNT and force, I think, is useful because it bypasses that, cognitive load. And I'm just like pushing them here, like, hey, stop me. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is all we're doing. It's based off of feel. You know what to do. This isn't like choreographing a movement for me.
Yeah.
And adding all this skill. Unfortunately, that's what our industry is built around, people who are just at a high skill athletically that have adopted these movements, and then they're trying to train it instead of working with the body in front of them, which, you know, I guess takes more nuance and is hard to replicate and standardize across a lot of people when you're teaching. But that's what I've found is much more effective, is just giving people the feeling, and then, okay, you own that, let's recreate it, and let's put more force into it.
And that's
Yeah.
probably why you tend to stay more with bilateral exercises. One, maybe it's just a more familiar environment for them to express that like motion in. Um, and then you've also mentioned that unilateral exercises tend to drive more compensations, or like people are more, or have an easier time like falling into whatever patterns in a unilateral context. Bilateral actually is a constraint for them that prevents them from doing that. Is that something that you find with most of your people? You're just kind of not just striving into that unilateral sphere a whole lot?
I don't think of that as a fix. Like when there's a, you know, shows up as like a frontal plane deficiency and people are rotating and they have an asymmetry on a bilateral exercise and you put them unilateral, they like that more, they feel safer, they feel better, but it's feeding, they're able to mask and to actually go into that compensation more. So maybe it's like, hey, I can work here, I can train better, but it's like, are you improving? Like, this is making you, if anything, taking you further away from getting to the bilateral movement. So yeah, I like bilateral just to objectively assess what's going on, and then I'll modify the shit out of that once again so that they could safely do it and not have an issue, and we'll build from there. And yeah, I think of unilateral a lot of times for in that situation as more like accessory type of work.
What do you think is the most fundamental quality or like beneficial quality about the torque bar?
Kind of what I was explaining before is that you don't have to think. Like it gives you a task and it gives you a direction of force to fight against. And so the execution of it, I like things where you just don't have to think and you could feel.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's easier to manipulate. Okay, so you have the task, and then you could work downstream and like, this is where we want to contribute.
Yeah.
Like we talked about, again, going more proximal than distal to contribute, but orienting around that task is what I like.
Yeah, I like the demand or feedback that it provides immediately, and the pushback after you've given some tension and it starts to unravel. It gives a pretty good indication of how we can unravel, but also retain tension. And so
Yeah.
this effort, like as it pushes back, you start to like coincidentally give like a little bit of way at your joints, and it starts to pull you a little bit. And in order for us to manage that as it's like unloading, you can stretch with it to a degree or grow with it to a degree. And I think that the tensile strength that we can manage there is um, an effort to not just receive the load, but to press back into it or to equivocate it. So like manage you're on a skateboard, just not falling off the thing that's bouncing back into you, or a bike, for example. Um, but the thing that it does, which we feel more often in our feet than we do in our hands, is the push back into the hands. You can't do this in that position. Like you can't control the bar with that like stiff hand that most people try to coordinate their feet with. And as they get more round here, there's more allowance in the tissue, and the tissue can start to roll with it a little bit. And so that inundates a little bit more, in my perspective, pressure and tension through the ground because of the relationship between arms and legs. And so in the way that this happens, so too, like your knees are forward, your legs are down, you start to exhibit the same pressure line, so to speak, from elbow to wrist instead of from hip to foot.
No, I love that. Yeah, that's how I imagine it is when you're closing the stick. Okay, so that is the direction of tension, right? So that's already defined and connected to. And then can you widen and like hug your body around that tension?
Yeah.
And that is like, you have to be rooted through the ground in order to create that. So yeah, the stick, if anything, is just like the target point. And the more that you can get big while maintaining that direction and that tension, like you said, I mean, that was the whole like chi torque thing me and Chris were geeking out over, is like that moving of that through the body, that
Yeah.
just, and everything else is an expression of this like torque creation back and forth, which is in everything we do. So yeah, I think that tool, especially how you guys are viewing it and using it, man, it's very useful and powerful. And I'm usually using the lightest one possible for people. Like it's, I don't want them to think, because I want them to use that. The heavy ones, you'll see a lot of people just try to like muscle their arms,
Yeah.
especially like adults. Like a kid actually, when you give it to little kids, they like immediately intuitively know, oh, I'm using my body
Yeah.
to create that. And they never go to the distal limbs as their like
Right.
power muscle. It's not relatively proportionally not that strong. But adults, it's the opposite. Like you said, they live in these distal parts. That's like, people would rather curl something than roast something, than clean something,
Yeah.
than whatever the most efficient way for the body to do it is. Because of, well, I'm not sure. I think it's multifactorial. I think it has something to do with that map of our body moving through the world. And we're so like isolated in one spot, still applying force, but now it's just in this small space. Who knows?
Yeah,
No,
you were asking about how we kind of help people build this like visceral awareness. And one of the things that we do both with the shoulders and the hips is we emphasize actually almost like a taking back of all that like distal attention, or like that the way that somebody would muscle, or the way that I used to muscle the torque bar, where it's like you're almost driving completely from the front deltoid into the elbow into the bar, to find how you can utilize the armpit and really get the sensation of like the almost the meat of your arm to come back into your body and back towards that central point. There's almost a degree of the same thing we were talking about with the neck, with the swallowing suction that happens in your limbs. And being able to develop that through, whatever, like you could do like the Hercules hold kind of thing where your arms are getting ripped apart and you just have to maintain that and feel how your ribs, your lungs, your viscera are a big part of what's actually maintaining that. And then once you've developed that, you can take a context like the torque bar and feel how the pulling of your arm into body can be the main driver. It doesn't have to be your elbows actually moving away from your body to do it. If you go to my Instagram, I've got a post of me doing like a 60 kilogram torque bar like in April. And then when I did it just a couple of weeks ago in September, it looks completely different from a movement strategy standpoint. I'm way stronger with this like kind of newfound, again, just like suction. That's really the way that I like to communicate that to my clients, is you are literally taking this bone back into your body, because most of you have tried to leverage so much of your pressing motions, your gym motions through the like just that external torque.
It's yeah, it's like if you thought you're a spine first and you have like these, imagine you don't even have arms, you have this thing forming itself out like a turtle and it's building its length. You're gonna first have a need for space for the hand to travel through all this stuff to make sense for how it can rotate through all these motions. And more often than not, because there's so much complexity with how these things interwove, people go to the biggest nerve or the biggest nervous cluster, and they start to rotate around that as the fulcrum. And so it becomes, if your utensil fingers are your reaching fingers, regardless if you're going inside or outside. And so people are stuck in lines of tension because they don't have an inhibitory action anymore, because they're too consciously saying repeatedly.
Interesting. Yeah, that's I wonder if that's why you see people who will they'll try a heavy stick, not be able to do it, not be able to do it. They get it once and then they can just do it easily after that. And I think it's like, oh, I felt the movement strategy um, of where this is just is easy for my structure, which is, yeah, that bar is very different than, like you said, the what we're used to when we're pressing weights away from the body, where you can kind of get away with that external torque. And this is pure internal. It's like, oh, internal, I'm feeling that connection integrated more to the center, and that's what I'm moving around now. Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole can of worms there.
Oh, one thing I do want to talk on, because this has been something that's been going through the ether, like the spinal engine theory. They talk on it being that the spine is the thing we orient around, and I understand that the spine is something that does move to a degree with the intention to facilitate other things. But for the most part, it's inhibitory motion. That is, we're trying to prevent the spine from jostling around so that we can have a more substantively stable centric body. And so like our eyes can move around for that very reason, our limbs can move around for that very reason. And there's this argument about the camp on whether or not you should be bouncing back and forth with your head when you run, getting your head to go over your feet, or if you should be doing this. And I think at the end of the day, if we're trying to articulate motion, our legs are the bottom up relationship, our head and everything else that comes downward is the top down. And as we're a kinetic creature, we have to balance between the rhythm of instruction and the rhythm of input. And so until such time as we can have that be I know what's going on, we're going to try to control from one or the other. And if we're trying to control from cognition, we're likely going to try to mechanize our feet from our hands. And that's going to be that person that runs with real intention through their hands, or like real tension through their top structure. Just because when babies walk, they coordinated the first contact of a palm, not as their feet, but as their hands. And there's like this huge coincidental rhythmic patterning that we think in terms of our intrinsic body. Like when we're running, our hands are almost hearing that slap as we're running through the ground in that same pattern. So our hands do mechanize a lot of our feet. If we otherwise can receive enough force to our feet are going to develop well enough that they're not going to be tense at the byproduct of the hands. They're going to be reflexive at the byproduct of the pelvic floor. And so there's going to be a little more distance. There's going to be a little more space between underbelly and space between our space between our legs. And that's going to allow for more torque or torsion. But for the most part, if we're trying to fix a rotational effort, the first thing we do to protect the reach of our hands, or the distal point, is we create tension at the proximal point, which is like space tucking in our butt, space tucking our shoulders, whatever it may be in that. And until we can put force through our body while retaining the air pressure that retains our butt to our mouth, just literally our midline, we won't have an awareness or cognizance of how we stay supported through force. So there'll be subsections that have the tension in order to create the kinetic value back and forth. And I think the best way for someone to manage their inherent structure is to build their rib cage out from their organs so that they're as wide as their lungs can be. And then at that point, they're not going to be rotating to pull their lungs bigger, or they're not going to perceive there being an ambient space that they want to torque more. They're going to use the muscles built in to start to drive more length between the bicep and tricep so as to drive the force in that limb. The more that we can be as long as we are, the biggest lever we are, the more force that we're outputting, just because the more ballast we have to have, and there's going to be tensile, like joint supporting, there's going to be muscle supporting. And if we can output that, then we're going to be taking a bigger body or more force and putting it through, creating more speed or whatever. And I guess Sorry, it's noisy as hell and I'm trying to focus. The way that that connects is that the intrinsic rotation is our throat, that if our throat is not staying big enough to maintain air, that we cannot breathe through it, we're going to start to twist or tension in our midline where we don't have that intrinsic valsalva. And if we don't have that, killing me. If we don't have that intrinsic valsalva, then we're going to start to find that the constriction of our midline garners us more mechanical tension immediately. And so it's the awareness that we have more allowance, not that we have more actionable tension. And that's a really hard thing to teach for people, because once there's the airway to run around, they're not going to start focusing on how their hands and feet are placed. They're going to focus on how well they stay at level or buoyant, like how well they stay upright, because it's a perception of consistency or predictability. So they'll be bracing relative the motion as opposed to bracing relative. Oh, my foot found the ground again. Oh, my foot found the ground. They're not just trying to rapidly perceive inputs from the kinetic. They're trying to maintain their buoyancy or maintain their upright. And that can only happen in the trunk.
That's a lot right there. That's a lot going on.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Have you given someone that experience?
Yeah, a ton of people. Like I
during sprinting.
I have a number of athletes that they've said to me, like, I've never run better. And we're not doing gait stuff. We're not doing anything around. We're not doing much visual stuff either, or much extrinsic lifting stuff. It's literally just reaccounting for their reflexive body. They're an athlete, so they've had the intrinsic musculature, but when they can become coherent with it and they don't fight it, they don't try to be actionable in the face of reflex, then they can allow for that to saturate more of their internal map, and then the output is substantial. Like I have one client who, I'm not going to name anything because I don't want to like get them in trouble, I suppose, because they have groups that are like they have a staff that helps rehabilitate if there's an injury. And one of my clients came to me with an injury in his shoulder, and it's like an overuse injury. So like strain that they said at first was tennis elbow. Next they said it was like an ulcer. Next they said it was, I think, an ulcer, but they were saying some crazy stuff like just like, oh, we don't know how to fix it, so it's your fault. And in working with him, I just created some of that, not focusing on these two fingers, but focusing on these three fingers and establishing the tissue support for that nerve pathway. And we played around in the positions and stabilized pronation to supination. And being able to lift more weight, being in a better mood, being able to throw a ball harder without immediately having to, like, I can't throw today. Those were all things that happened overnight, and they've been things that have been progressively happening more and more. So when your swallow improves, then your neck musculature improves. If you can bring that swallow down to your diaphragm, then your thoracic rotation improves. And then your bearing or loading downward onto thoracic rotation isn't at the compromise of lumbar flexion. It's at the support of pelvic pressure and the like. And so I've gotten people to just get more reflexive, and then their body takes over.
Yeah, that was my experience, especially coming from FP that I was pretty involved in. There was just so much focus on the rotations of the limbs, the hand to help drive the shoulder, to drive the ribs, to drive the hips, all these kind of like rotations within that. And then those are being weighted or developed in like a horizontal force vector context with different stuff. But I just ended up rotating everything around this, which wasn't really moving. And when I started to kind of rope all of that back into a I guess you could just say a more like central column, and then I started to produce force, I could just direct it much more focally. Like if I wanted to go through somebody playing basketball, much easier for me to like feel like viscerally what it would need to happen for me to do so. Or if somebody's trying to get past me, I was able to like ground much more effectively, which we haven't talked about a ton, but the grounding in conjunction with this like kind of midline central draw into everything like creates a pretty gnarly combination for force production. yeah, it was a complete. I could absolutely tell as soon as I kind of started feeling out what he was showing me that how much I was over rotating. But until I felt that, I would have never guessed. I would have thought that all this rotation was what would be needed for efficient elastic recoil or whatever. But I think, and maybe you can speak to this with your concept of like the spiral torque, which is kind of like the internal and external kind of working against each other, from my understanding. Um, all these spiraling motions doesn't necessarily mean you get the torque like all the way in, right?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception is once again following the distal parts to because you could create no torque but have yourself fully twisted with your hands, feet, and hips. And once again, going back to that center, it's that brace and drive, which could be very small, which I think it's where I'm thinking about it from a power output standpoint, like lifting. Like if you're going to do a torque when you lift, you don't want to make it beautifully expressive all the way. It's a very like, like punches. It's very tight.
Yeah.
Very tight from the center. So that's how I view it. And I think the hands, they're just an expression. Yeah. And I know like, Weck and other people, like they like to play around with how can we take that expression distally to the furthest point, which I think is cool to look at too. But I think the center is the foundation, and sending it outward. It's nice to have both ends of the spectrum, but I don't think it's good to get caught up in the distal end too much, because then you're missing the essence of it.
And there's a lot of room to expand inward before you expand outward.
Oh yeah.
As above, so below.
Okay.
Yeah, you guys were talking about this spinal engine is what you were trying to counter, I guess, right? That's what people focus on. And I had a question. What do you guys think? How much easier would this be if we had tails?
Oh, dude.
We felt that and kind of could orient around that.
If we know how big our pelvis was, we wouldn't be orienting specifically men toward the our. So I think the way that we mechanize is we go around to the thing that's most sensitive, and our butt is not that sensitive thing that we're orienting around. I think men go from nuts to butts more often than not. And that's why we don't have a perception of our pelvic floor, because we're consuming it with our pelvis, or we're consuming it with the backside tail. And if a man knew how to elongate there, it wouldn't so much feel like they're making vulnerable their pelvic floor. It would feel like they're deepening it. And there's
grounding through it.
Yeah. And that requires less output from the pelvis. It requires more like of that like allowance becoming a little more, it vacuums upward. And the arch in the same way is not trying to like push into the ground. It's trying to create some of that groundedness so you can push weight through it. So I think most people are too stuck into the articulation of the things that are biggest in their brain. And they're like, when they're talking to themselves, asking themselves, how do they do something? There are things that are responding and more messaging. And so they assume that's the thing they need to talk to. So like the fingers, for example, I can see you have a point of tension at your thumb. Your thumb is, there's a little bit of tonal like heaviness on the inside of your thumb pad. Right. So it comes over. And so you're probably lacking a little bit of external rotation value in the ulna, or internal rotation value there that's being compensated for in the thumb. So like you might have a little heavier of a bump right there on the outside of the elbow. Yeah, which is just the ulna not coming into supination as much as the thumb is orienting that supination. And so that would be a distal effort where we're creating a lot of like bicep flexion or a lot of like forearm contraction, as opposed to creating the depth inside of us, which would amount to being like peripheral heart pressure, peripheral lung pressure, and which is essentially lymphatic drainage. And yeah, that's why you'll see someone that's like see a lot of dudes that are in the NFL, particularly like a running back or wide receiver or cornerback, that have these capped off shoulders, and then they have the depth of their armpit that's tremendous, and you can see the lines of their serratus. It doesn't look like it's pushing outward. It looks like it trims downward, and it's like it's girdling their rib cage as opposed to moving their rib cage, meaning that they pull deep enough into there that they don't have the negative space around their lungs, that they can get as much lung volume as their ribs can maintain relative to their force output. Because if you're running a lot, your lungs are inherently going to start to volumize better, because not just are you putting more weight atop them, your lungs need to be more buoyant, but you also have to have the fuel for your output. So inherently, whenever you're putting the pressure in on it, it's creating an intrinsic muscle reflex or inhibitory response. That's what core bracing is. It's take the hit, let it move through the tissue. Don't try to push against the hit. Don't be inert, be kinetic. Like you can see in the tone, their skin wraps around their muscle instead of muscle being isolated and sticking out. Like a strong man will have big muscle belly, but they won't have the connected muscle bellies.
Do you guys spend a lot of time looking at photos of athletes and people's?
Like for recreation or?
Yeah, for fun. Yeah.
No, I've just noticed that the people who move with more energy efficiency also have a calm demeanor about themselves. They don't present like there's going to be an erratic nature to their behavior. And so it's almost animal, and there's a threat that comes with it if you're not in a state of reactivity in your own right. So if you're, when I used to be in threat state all the time and I was like injured or whatever, I would notice it way more. Like that's a competent body or a threatening body. And if you can associate that, more often than not, the people who aren't consciously provoking certain threatening behaviors, it's more actually just noticing someone who has competencies or balance systems that are working that we don't. And that's an efficiency. It's like a competitive edge someone has, being relaxed in their efficiency. And it's like the far end of what most people perceive. We have to grit down to get more strong, but you'll see a lot of people who are really, really fit have big ass smiles. Like their smiles are fixed and fitted to their jaw, like the shape of their jaw and the size of their neck and their height. And they have either deep voices or like really well-toned midlines. And you can see that it's not like a push forward. Things are like relaxedly big, like a Jason Momoa type. Big smile, like almost goofy presentation of happiness you'd see on someone that just like makes jokes a lot, but it doesn't look like it's a separate feature to his jaw. It looks like his physicality grew with his, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. What do you guys think? Didn't you used to be, you and your you used to have a buddy, Nathan, in Flowbility?
Oh yeah, Ruben.
Yeah. What do you guys think about the kind of pattern? Because it's all like looking for patterns that fit the and building models from it. What do you guys think about that?
I think they're great at seeing shapes. I don't think that they're very good at perceiving shapes in motion or knowing how tissue supports a shape. So like your nervous system can fix to or conform to whatever shaping or tensegrity you want to put through it. It's just like electrical signaling that you maintain, and then your body starts to adjust to that output. And if your inputs are constant or you're fixed to paying attention to certain things, then it's okay to remediate how you stand, because you're only paying attention to those things that those parts of the body can pay attention to. My first consideration of it, it's a sympathetic practice that drives a lot of compression or reduction of the midline and a lot of engorgement, or the breathing facilitates the growth of that sympathetic or peripheral body. And so it does grow the brain, but it does not grow the brain in a way that the brain can feel happy and safe without the effort. So it requires the continued maintenance. And a couple of things that I'll like the things that they do, they come into a position that's internally rotated, but it's the fixture of these fingers. They're pushing through literally pushing through the nerve line that facilitates internal rotation. So there's a lacking inhibitory response. And when you're cognizantly pushing through something consistently, it doesn't have the ability to inhibit in its own right. So there is no reflex there. You're building out a tissue response that's designed around your fabrication of how you think it should look, less so how it feels in motion. No
It
force.
also might be the least grounding practice that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Everything is up, right? You literally see them trying to roll themselves like up off the ground, and then they're also like falling forward the entire time too. And I understand the idea of like forward intent. I understand that you should be comfortable and competent probably on that kind of forward edge of motion, but to think that you need to be there all the time and to only work on how you're like removing yourself up and off the ground versus how you're rooting, how you're building the center, and really how you can, I guess, either compress the center inward like we've been talking about, or even more so like decompress top to bottom versus just bottom up, right? Which people only think that we have to lift ourselves up off the ground. We can't just like lower ourselves through our legs, which is just a different, same relative motion, just happening this way instead of this way. It just seems like they get fixed in those ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I like some of their stuff, but I see it just like the vacuum we were talking about. It's touching an edge of something that I think is nice because you get some more information. But yeah, the whole idea, you need to live here. This is how we're supposed to be, or this is the most optimal. I don't get into that conversation. But you said, Benjamin, you were an FP.
I was a human.
They let you out?
Specialist. Hey, what did you say?
I said they let you out. So did you have to escape?
I might still be a part of it, man. I never officially like slammed the door on them. Yeah, I still like will put like that I'm an FP HPS1 on my profile because there's still like, I don't know, people who at least come from FP who see the stuff know that I've at least done it, so I understand to some degree what they're trying to accomplish. And in general, like I'm still trying to accomplish the same shit that most FP practitioners are, or at least the ethos of FP of just like better movement, more function overall. It's just I haven't like narrowed it into this specific set of parameters, or really I just firsthand saw how the approach that I was being taught just wasn't like working for my tougher clients, and it kind of had a bit of a plateau for myself. And it really was, I think, it came down to just too much motion, just too much trying to spiral everything, too much like distal focus. And I haven't really received any backlash from leaving. I imagine we actually have a podcast that's going to drop probably this weekend where we talk about FP a little more at length. That might give me some blocks. That might take me off the the FP page, but we'll see. We'll see.
I mean, do you still find any tools or narratives that you took from there valuable?
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely value in trying to find unilateral connections, like finding how my opposite glute can be an engine for my opposite shoulder. It's just I can't skip all the shit that's in between. And there's like a feeling that needs to be like created first, again, a central feeling before that stuff can really like take hold. Like the first 2 or 3 years of myself doing it, I was in the mindset of decompressing all the time, right? So I'm trying to lift myself up by my bootstraps and I'm taking my ribs and my hips away from each other. And then I'm rotating, and I can rotate pretty easily from there, but it just doesn't feel connected. It doesn't feel like it's accessing like the deeper fascia or tissue that I need to hydrate. And then to be fair, this was actually a different FP practitioner that had me more so try to like compress down. Like it was more so like a 6-pack crunch and then like some pushing out of the belly and then do the rotation, which for given where I was at, that kind of gave me a better sense of where the center was and a better sense of being able to rotate through there. But yeah, I'll still play around with some of like the chamber sequences and the different ways to load things. And I'm, especially given I'm rehabbing like kind of back to running, like I'm playing around with some of it, but there's a lot of the dynamic exercises that I could do right now with a shitty Achilles because I'm using a dumbbell to like move myself over, and I'm just like allowing the weight to dictate how I'm moving versus actually producing the force off the ground. There's a lot of stuff that I just realized that, yeah, maybe this is teaching some level of efficiency and like rhythm. And again, there's a time and place where I'll do that with people, but it tends not to be the most fundamental things that I could like help somebody develop. It tends to be maybe a little bit of accessory work, like you said.
So you guys see the midline series of pressurized areas, the vacuums, as the foundation when you're working with people. And then after that's integrated, then you kind of break in maybe rotation, shoulders and hips. Is that fair to say?
I think really any mechanic can be built upon the base that we're trying to create with people. There's a lot to be said for how in depth you can go into like building out that midline connection. Where if you go too soon into trying to integrate again these rotational patterns, then maybe you miss out on some of the potential. But Nathan, what's your take on that?
I do agree with you. I think it connectedly, we had talked about center earlier, being able to provide yourself center. If you think intrinsically that center is the root of bracing, and if you manage around that in each step or in each whatever you're doing, if you can retain your ability to come back to an easy or like yourself, your center, then I'd imagine that you can correlate that more often than not. The reason why these systems didn't work is because they have you devolving your center and then recapturing it in a different position. And so it's trying to, you're saying you didn't have the connection between here and the hip. I would imagine that you did for a moment. You turned a little bit and you shifted a little bit. You moved your vis around and you're like, all right, it's like turning the lights out and then like seeing the room in one stage, and then you turn the lights on and there's like stuff moving around periodically. And you're like, I don't know where anything is. I can't walk through here in the dark. That's essentially what's happening. So there's like if you have your fixed center, you know always how much weight is being pushed down on your femurs. You know how much weight is retaining the weight or being pulled through your arms. And if you can retain your awareness around your torso, then it's not about motion. It is about your ability to motion in any direction at any time. So like if you're tripping over, like I've stepped on my dog's tail before and I don't want to put all my weight down on that. So how do I immediately drop the weight off my foot that I'm stepping on and then put weight on a foot that was mid through the air? Like I have to manage my hips balance while picking my legs up against my hips in the air. And that's only something that I can do if I have a pelvic structure to pull against. Only if I have an abdominal structure to push down into that pelvic floor with. Like if you're grappling and you have someone in guard, your ability to pull them into guard or hold them there isn't so much a squeeze effort. It's a maintenance of closeness and a maintenance of contact through all those points. So like they feel as much they can't move backwards, they can't move forward or sideways. It's not so much you're trying to put them into a vice as you are trying to coat them. And that's the effort with the abdominals. Like whenever we're trying to balance, we're trying to put as much of our abdominal weight through the limb. And as we do that, we generate more return stability. So when the force comes through us, we're bouncing with the force as opposed to relative our hands position. So my answer to that is we fix pressure through the midsection, and that is something that viscerally supports itself, and it starts to coincide with how we breathe and how we regulate our intrinsic rhythm. And so we begin to build off of intrinsic sensation as opposed to extrinsic feedback or reception of inputs, and thereby we get more allowance for our brain speaks in a language that is limbic. It does not orient around our outputs. It orients around how safe is it to expand and take up space, and how safe is it for our organs to be at their fully most robust fashion without feeling like they're going to be restricted or whatever. That just means our heart can pump without feeling impact. Our lungs can expand without feeling impact. Everything can move without there being I can't move here.
And I think the heart of it all is really first making sure the person has the ability to listen, like listen to their body and like listen to the pressure, sensations, just listen in general. If they're not doing that and they're always having a motor output trying to tell them what to do, like I trained somebody this morning, and I was just having her do a simple like hinge pattern, and she keeps saying like, oh, my brain's like stopping me, I keep like thinking about this, thinking about that. I'm like, okay, we're just going to pay attention to sensation. We're only going to listen. I don't care about you outputting anything. All I want you to do for the first 3 reps is feel for the shirt on your back. Feel how that shirt moves as you go through the motion. And she like did it more fluidly. There was less like of an impulse to try to micromanage things. And then I was like, okay, now slide your hands down your legs as you're doing it. And sometimes like for people who just they can't output without some sort of like sympathetic response, they're just not really listening. And that is like the root of, I think, the more like parasympathetic starting point that we're trying to get people at. From there, you can start to load them. You can start to really like, I don't know, kind of stress their body in a way that starts to build that center more and more. But if they don't have the capacity to just like sit and listen to themselves first, then whatever you try to do, it isn't going to go as far as it could.
I love that. I love that. That might be the thing. The biggest problem I see in like mainstream fitness industry.
I don't know if it's just me or if it's
Yeah,
just,
your audio got like super robotic there for a second.
Hello. Is that
whatever.
It's still the same. I
Okay.
can understand you. It's just like you're a little bit more of an overlord now.
Yeah,
let me try to
calling from the future. Am I getting through?
Okay. Better?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, that to me right now the biggest issue I have with the narratives from the mainstream fitness are that sensation doesn't matter, and like you just set up the position, the joint angles, there's the mechanical tension, doesn't matter what you feel, that has no impact on stimulus, hypertrophy, I guess they're concentrating on. And I think even in that realm, kind of what you're saying, what someone feels is very important. And of course, it's hard to measure. It's subjective, which is why maybe people are brushing it to the side. But I think sensory competency in movement, I'm always asking, where do you feel it? Like we have an intended tissue that we just want to connect to and feel. Like I'm big on my muscle connection. And no matter what it looks like, if someone has that, it's always better than just trying to look a certain way. But hey, I'm feeling it in my back. Hey, this is just unpleasant in general for me. Like to me, that then we miss the point of what we're trying to get out of this. So that made a lot of sense to me when you were trying to talk them through just sensing their body and giving them some input to focus on.
Yeah, and at a certain level, I don't even necessarily care if they feel it in the correct place because they're almost like hung up on doing so and getting it right.
Mhm.
I just want them to move at this point and move with a little bit of load. We'll get to like maybe the right way to do it or the more distributed globally way to do it. But I just got to get you moving and out of your head first.
Do we have one specific answer that I can fresh you guys up on that I answered in like 9 different ways before? That is when you're asking specifics of what I target or what I emphasize to create the rotation or create the whatever, we have this almost linear orientation toward forward, and we try to capacitate forward as quickly as possible. And it doesn't seem like creating force along this back line is going to be as forward as creating force along this front line.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to get it so people have management of like the same equivocal blood flow and pump that you'd feel in these fingers if you're doing a curl or whatever, you'd have throughout the entire arm, not just in those fingers that you're trying to like roll through, which plays into the peripheral body has to be more supportive without there being a visual support for it. So I don't want to have to turn my head to know where my shoulder is. I want my neck to be as deep as my chest to my back is, so that I have as much space for my shoulder to grow big and carry the peripheral weight or the load of force coming around my body. Because if my shoulder's here, I don't have a side of my body. That's no longer the case. My ribs are being pulled forward, or I'm inhibiting the rotation forces because my shoulders are trying to push into them. So I need to have um, essentially my arms moving backward into my spine without my spine moving forward. And that's going to mean me driving force into my lat or into my anterior rib cage, and me being able to deliver it down my body or through my shoulders. But regardless, I need to be able to manage the force that's running. Essentially, my elbow's torquing past my esophagus and diaphragm, so it's going to torque my midsection. And if I'm not supportive through my transition between aerobic body and anaerobic body, as I'm torquing, I'm going to want to twist as much as possible here to get as much visceral response from the organs I'm trying to pay attention to. So people pay attention to intensity, or the intensity of input, as opposed to the quality of input. And so you'll see someone who doesn't have a center does not appear centered. So there's a confluence of emotion, or use thoughts behind the eyes, and you'll see them like moving around or tensioning, and there's anger in their face. Even if they're not experiencing anger, you see the things that coincide with intensity or focus or forward, or I need to bring my attention back to where I was, instead of it being intrinsic, like swallowing that expression, letting the face dissipate, letting there be no extrinsic value for how you feel, but allowing for the experience to wash over you. I think most people, and I'm going to give a little barb to like Goda, for example, they talk about being very parasympathetic, but the flow state that they do, the wormy stuff they do, does not facilitate inherent flow state, because they're mechanizing an output. They're not allowing for themselves to ebb in that flow state. So they're not allowing themselves to adjust with that rotation. They're fixing that rotation, telling it that's how the body has to move to. So the rotation model is not incorrect. Their approach to it is external. So they're not abiding the intrinsic ability for the psoas to offload pressure or offload rotation without twisting, because it has to twist or it has to pull back into their overarched lower back to dissipate the force of the psoas or the leg, as opposed to being able to deliver it to a strong and big upper body. Because you're not going to see football players who run around with force with the intention to run someone over doing that. Like maybe behind closed doors, but not in a game. Like they're not trying to run through someone with like this, ooh, look at this.
Yeah, that's an issue. I mean, even if they're taking video from athletes and saying, here's a pattern I recognize from the athlete, the idea that you can just mimic it by twisting is like, that's not what they're doing. And that's not the reason their feet are doing that, right? It's coming from something upstream, and that's just the expression. So
totally.
And it's like, where are
people that have never felt it themselves?
Yeah, and what's the result? I haven't seen much result from, other than you need to keep doing it so you look like this, instead of like, are you better? Like, do you feel better? Are you stronger? Are you performing better?
Well, they're more receptive to it. They're definitely paying attention to areas that have a lot of nerves, and they're putting blood flow through there. So there will be an inherent uptake in at least information quality, if not output.
I mean, I experimented, and Go to Coach worked with me for 3 months. They reached out and were like, hey, we think this is up your alley. I was like, I'll go all in. This is a experiment for me. Dude, I felt horrible. I don't get low back pain, but my low back I felt like an old man. I moved like an old man. I was like, I got to stop this. And the coach told me, oh yeah, that's normal. You have to get through that before you could feel better. You're still breaking your habits. And like, that's a good sign. I'm like, this is a good sign that I feel like an old man. And that's when I was like, I don't know about this.
Trust the process.
Trust the process.
Not your
yeah.
body, the process. Trust the process.
And you
Yeah,
see that in FP and GOTA and, you know, a lot of even FRC. It's like, hey, you gotta do this thing and you have to stop everything. Like you can't lift anymore. That's a beta move, or that's reverse gear training or whatever. And I think just people stopping working out, maybe they feel better after that, you know? So it's like, is it the thing you're doing, or is it the fact that you're not training anymore?
Yeah.
So I always appreciate the things that are like, hey, do this and you're just stronger. You're just better in general. You're more resilient. You can handle more. And it sounds like what you guys are saying is like, just shit works better when you're organizing around this and focusing on that.
If I were to make a claim, we do have an understanding of posture. It doesn't orient around a fixed mechanical structure. It orients around a fixed physiological capacity. So if we have the ability to let our organs function while we do the things that we're doing, then we have no issues in our nervous system to be like, all right, we have to fix these things happening. So it's essentially a input competency thing where we have to become more sensitive than we are. And we have to organize that sensitivity threshold without it being a cognitive thing, the way that kids do. So kids don't perpetuate their meaning behind the, I fell, this is because of these things. They're like, I fell, I'm not going to let that happen again. And so they figure out how to not let it happen again, instead of being like, okay, I was definitely off on my ankles. I should have had my ankles. Like, there's no kid that's being like, dude, my inside ankle bone needs to be higher. It's just not happening.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I've seen a particular GOTA coach talk about how basically GOTA is being done very poorly by the majority of the coaches. And he basically pointed out all the stuff that's like crazy obvious to the rest of the industry. And it's just like the way they're marketing it and the way that they're teaching these extremely binary concepts will tend to attract worse trainers, because the worst trainers want just, it's either good or bad. Like I just need something that's super visual that I can see, that I can measure. The joint angles 22.5 this way, give me the lines on the floor, let's just make sure thigh this way, and you're just, when you're focusing so much on that, you're inherently missing out on a lot, and you have no idea how deep rooted some of these like potential issues are. You're just getting them on the math. And to be fair, this guy is kind of like, he's mentioning good things, like he's kind of taking people out of the over rotation a little bit and stuff, but it's just like when the system is creating poor execution, then how legit is this system in the first place?
Yeah. What they say is not necessarily how they follow through with it. This is the guy that Flow Ops.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the ride or die GOTA guy. And the fact that he's talking in the alternative now is just to say that he understands more of the body, having done Mewing recently, and having the impact of what it does for his nervous system, not having to compensate for maybe too much pressure behind his sinuses or too little neck rotation relative to his eyes, because his eyes were like being restricted by his sinuses. At the end of the day, if you know more about the body, you're going to have better answers, and maybe your direction is going to be a little bit more holistic for people. At the end of the day as well, we have to be more cognizant that we're not, if we're talking from this perspective, our gains need to be more clear to our people, so they understand why it is it doesn't come from GOTA, his understanding right now. A lot of the allowance of things is coming from his Mewing stuff, and so he's extrapolating off of things that have worked for him. And that's usually how the ego in this industry goes, where people will be more primed to say, I figured this out, as opposed to, I didn't know what I was talking about before. They'll just stick to their whatever. And I think it's important for people to know that the more well managed we are intrinsically, the less we're going to have issue with the feedback coming back at us, especially if we have better feedback with the orientation of our face, wherein if we describe what fascia is, it is designed around the expression of emotion, particularly the expression of emotion of the face. So if the face is not expressing emotion adequately, there is going to be a limitation and or juncture between how we can perceive and how we can express. And for most of us, especially men, if we're keeping a lot of tension into our guttural region, we're not giving enough like space to our undercarriage, then we're going to be tucking a lot. We're going to be holding tension and the like. And for me, that despite having like an athletic or physical confidence about myself growing up, I had so much threat induction from injury or from environment that I was doing a lot of things that I had ass meat that I never used. And so as soon as flowbility was actually the one that gave me some credibility for, oh, we just need to change the posture. We don't need to. And so I started to pay attention to how I was putting pressure on my pelvis. And then overnight, I'm like, where the cheeks were. Okay, welcome back. Good to see you guys. Because the weight was never an issue for me. I could push weight, but my butt wasn't like, all right, we're just going to hang out on this guy for a little bit. And as I grew, we called it weirder but wider at first. But as I grew, it was literally, oh, I'm expanding. And it was the saturation of my parasympathetic body, or I was filling out according to how big my frame is, less so my perception of my frame.
Parasympathetic body is always going to be wider than the sympathetic body.
Bigger,
you would say.
More extensive. Because if you think about exhales being flexive and flexion being sympathetic, then an inhale, if it's well done and it's not antagonistic to your nervous system, it should be extensive. It should create extension through your body, and that should purvey a greater scope of big, and that's competency to you. That's like it's parasympathetics, it's performance, it's optimization, or it's output.
So you're relating exhale to sympathetic.
It makes you smaller, it makes you more contractile, makes it easier to flex. And that's why most often people will bench press with an exhale through the push, despite their lungs getting smaller on that position. Like they're thinking that output is going to be made easier by focusing it. And that's because when they inhale, they don't have a focused inhale. So for people bench pressing, the best thing for them to do, aside from learning how to tension the bar inside and outside, so like inhale upward, squeezing the bar inward. And so your intention is to grow your lungs, but also grow your internal rotation through the inhale. And that's going to make you more extensive through the force bearing effort. And on the exhale, pulling apart and learning how to load in a more open or receptive fashion. So you retain the volume you earned on your inhale.
Interesting. Yeah, most people think about that the other way around.
Yeah, it starts to connect the shoulders and the motion of the arm. So the torque of the arm feeds into the torso better. And so the ribs start to mechanize. That's why we do the lateral body stuff. That's why I have people doing some squeezing against their arms, and I consider the armpits groins. I consider it being a triumvirate of groins, or 4 if you consider the throat and swallow. So that would be the intrinsic groin, and these are the 3 that buffer around it. Arches.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's all arches.
All arches, yeah. And arches, I think triangulation. Arches and triangulation. Like 3 points of context. Like you have a fulcrum, and then you have 2 orientations around it, like the bar and perhaps your belly and your output into the ground, or your like there's always going to be like a coincidental effort to brace and then to output. And so it's like almost like a 3-fold effort to think, to feel, to do. And it's like a recycling effort of interchanging intelligences or awarenesses in the body, creating the ingrandized picture. That's not more words or more feeling or more action. It's a mixture of everything.
Let me ask you guys one more question.
Yeah.
So with this foundation and model, if you were to work with someone who's like, hey, my main goal is bodybuilding, I want to do a show, how would you implement these concepts into someone looking for, because a lot of bodybuilding is like intentionally doing things inefficient.
Yep.
Right. You want to build these distal muscles and everything. So how would you approach that?
So that was actually what Chris and I were going to do a little bit of talking into, because neither of us were the functional fitness type, getting the proper bilateral, unilateral movement. It was like we were in the gym lifting or doing something that was like more force bearing. And for me, I think that it goes hand in hand. If you have good coincidental like awareness intrinsically, it should reflect on the aesthetic. And oftentimes people confuse like tone, like intense tone for quality tissue, like having veins in the hands or veins in the arms. But more often than not, it's the saturation of tissue, it's the pump of tissue. So it's really, I have an aesthetic that I'm going for that's very much like the bodybuilding aspect, but with less of the midline prolapse. So what they do a lot of is they compromise their spine position for the front side dynamics. And so they really build out their front line, and it's so sympathetic that it looks toned out. And
that's not growth hormone.
well, it's that too.
But that's that belly, that like bodybuilder belly thing you're talking about.
That's for sure the hormones. That's not a natural prolapse. But you'll start to see how the back starts to form around it. Their neck gets small. There's still the same spinal issues that a lot of people have. In getting a bigger rib cage or shoulder girdle, you need for a bellied out diaphragm, and the curvature of your butt is going to be more formed out. If you have a bigger diaphragm, your ribs are going to be more volumized around the side, so you'll carry yourself. There's more volume for your shoulder front to back. Like I'm not lifting and I'm getting bigger, or I'm getting more fitted to myself. Like my hands starting to fit my wrist better, and they're moving in sequence better. Like my bicep moves with my hand. Like everything is sequentially getting more fitted through the kinetic chain. So I think that proper mechanics does translate to good development, but the way that you get those mechanics to operate is having a reflexive nature about them. So I think we're going to the root and hitting mechanics, aesthetics, and like sensory, like your sense, your state of being, whether it be fight or flight or rest and digest.
Yeah, I think the standard like Arnold Schwarzenegger, like intention, like mind muscle connection stuff, just like really what we're doing is building on it and creating maybe more of a holistic sense of how to do that. And that can be, again, some of this like suction stuff, some of how like, again, you can turn your forearm either from your thumb a lot, or you can actually make it happen from the elbow, from the more proximal end. And say you're a bodybuilder and you've been trying to make your forearms bigger by just doing all this like wrist curl stuff. You might find that it's actually the connection into body that allows your forearm to grow, to essentially open up the hose. So if you're a bodybuilder who has like these weak spots in your aesthetic, like odds are you just have a poor connection to them. And yeah, you might be able to flex the muscle all you want, but it's not like an extensive flex. It's like a bicep that's like super high versus a bicep that's both long and high, which is something that maybe you've experienced, maybe you've played around with in the idea of kind of like voluntary muscle contractions, in that like I can flex my six pack and make myself super small, or I can like flex my six pack and still feel like the width, the big belly sensation, this like big central pressure that I can like work off of. It's like either a flexive flex or a small flex versus this like bigger flex. And I think that skill is probably part of this like parasympathetic body that we're talking about building out. And if you're a bodybuilder and you want just the more fuller physique, which I don't even know if that's actually the look that they would want. Like, I don't actually know if like a bodybuilder who did our stuff would win their competitions. Like might just be this different thing where this person just looks like a more three-dimensional version of the bodybuilder, but in these specific poses, maybe it's not what the judges are looking for. I have no idea, but I imagine that they would feel a lot better than being like, again, super compressed. When I see bodybuilders back sometimes, there's just so many of those divots, right? It's just like all the skin is bunched up in too small of an area. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for interviewing us, DJ. I really appreciate that.
No, this was a fun chat. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Maybe one question I have for you real quick that you can answer, because you have probably a longer history of like training people and getting the most out of people than either of us. What are some of the ways that you help people like either get the most out of their sessions with you or make the most out of their time between sessions? Like, how do you kind of like spur either an accountability or just like maybe more action so that you're not just like, they're not super dependent on you, they're actually cultivating their own sense of like habit or self-worth, I guess.
So the first question, how do I get more out of a session, is especially people coming in, I guess, when I'm trying to sell or have buy-in, or people are hesitant. I'm always trying to find a win for the day. So it's like, what do you want? What's your issue? And they're like, can we do this? Because my shoulder hurts. And I'll go right to that. And like, why does your shoulder hurt? If we can press or do this and your shoulder feels good and you don't have pain, that's the goal. And that's like a win. So I always try to find those things to have them actually feeling like more competent, confident, and like they gain something, which is usually just by finding different strategies to move. And then letting them know, hey, from now on, this thing you learned about yourself, use that from now. Like, this feels better for you. This is a different strategy you have. Now you have another tool in your tool belt. And I like that kind of empowerment better than like, okay, here's homework to fix so that you can one day fix yourself or you're broken. So I like the framing it around that, so they leave feeling like they discovered something and now they have a little more that they earned, or they always had with them, really more tools. So I try to do that.
I dig it.
That's dope. All right, man. Thanks so much for chatting with us for almost 2.5 hours there. That was a lot of fun.
Our longest podcast by far.
Rogan podcast.
Yeah, this is what it feels like. People can find you at Strong Camps. You got the Chi Torque course. You got you got a torque bar course. You got a bunch of stuff going on. Anything else new that you want to kind of like put out there?
No, yeah. If you go on at Strong Camps link tree to all the courses and all the stuff I'm going to be putting out. Hopefully, yeah. One thing, I'm getting a platform ready to kind of show a lot of cool stuff, experimentation, exploration of concepts, and I would love to have you guys on there. So
Awesome.
Yeah, hopefully do some stuff together with you guys. So
Cool. Appreciate you.
Yeah,
Thank you for coming on, dude.
yeah. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Later, buddy.